Do you remember the movie Santa Claus 2 when the North Pole tried to replicate Santa Claus and kind of make two Santa Clauses? That way, the real Santa Claus could be in one place and the replica Santa Claus could be in another, so that the real Santa Claus could get more done and so that the North Pole could be more efficient. Well, that isn't what actually ended up happening in the North Pole. It ended up being a major disaster. The fake Santa Claus ended up being this tyrant. He just could not be the real Santa Claus. There were things about him that were fundamentally different, and therefore this just didn't work out, created a huge mess, a power struggle at the end of the movie, culminating in fortunately, the real Santa Claus reclaiming his rightful role as Santa Claus. Now, I think that something very similar to this is happening in modern Christianity, and I want to talk about it. But first, let me just tell you, if you leave a comment on this video that disagrees with me or adds something to this conversation, be it some sort of objection or some other perspective to think about, if you write it out really well and do a good job, and if it's good faith, respectful, all those things, I might choose to respond to it on Monday in a video. So if you are interested in something like that, please go ahead and leave your best comment down below. Now, what happened in Santa Claus 2 is very similar to how the PCA started and how the EPC started and how ECO started and how the OPC started and any other offshoot denomination from some sort of mainline church. I'm going to focus mostly on Presbyterianism today, but what these denominations really were trying to do was they were trying to take traditional Presbyterianism. Now, the mainline Presbyterian church had gone liberal in some one way, shape, or form that these groups of people did not want, pressured them to leave. And so they tried to take traditional Presbyterianism, the heritage of the Presbyterian tradition, and they tried to kind of move it to a new denomination, to a new institution that was healthier and didn't deal with the same sort of issues. And of course, like I said, that's because the PCUSA, the mainline Presbyterian church, had developed all these issues, moral issues, theological issues, errors, heresies, all these types of things. Now, if I were to make up my own Presbyterian denomination, what would I include? Well, of course, anyone trying to do such a thing would have to include councils and elders. It would have to have basically a hierarchy of councils made up of elders that made decisions, steered the church doctrinally, enforced certain rules and theological principles. It would have to have Reformed theology. The theology would be based on the teachings of John Calvin and that sort of broad tradition of theology. It would hold to certain confessions, historic Reformed confessions of faith, like the Westminster Confession, the Belgic Confession, the Scots Confession, things like that. And of course, it would also, to a lesser or more degree, practice Reformed liturgy and the Reformed kind of robust idea of the sacraments. Now, all of these denominations that I mentioned, including the PCUSA, have these aspects to a lesser or more degree. But there's one more aspect that I think is essential to Presbyterianism, such that if you take it out of Presbyterianism, it just isn't Presbyterianism anymore, and that is that it is correctable. The reason I say that is because Presbyterianism is an institutional church. It has a government. It's connectional. And the reason that's important is because when we think of a Presbyterian church, what does the word Presbyterian mean? It means that it's governed by elders. Now, we know that an independent church with elders isn't necessarily Presbyterian. The Presbyterian faith is a tradition, and part of that tradition is necessarily this aspect of correctability. Basically, if the church errs or there's some problem that arises in the church, and even if it persists for a long time, the structure of Presbyterianism, the system of government, it allows it to be corrected once the Holy Spirit guides the people, the clergy within the church, toward that end. Now, of course, the OPC, the PCA, the EPC, they all have a degree of correctability, right? They have these councils of elders. They have presbyteries, synods, general assemblies. Well, they might not have synods, but they have councils of elders. And if a minor problem arises in the church, they will get together and handle it. And I've seen this happen as a former member of the OPC. I've seen it happen at their Presbyterian meetings. They all do it. The PCA right now is dealing with certain issues that lots of people are talking about. I'm not going to get into it in this video. But of course, they're going to try to correct that. But there's only one of the denominations that I've mentioned in this video that have this correctability to an ultimate degree. And that is the PCUSA. The problem with these denominations, the PCA, the EPC, the ECO, OPC, the ones that schismed from the PCUSA, is when they schismed, when they separated, what they were essentially doing was they were giving up on that corrective process. They were removing themselves and their church from the corrective mechanism that is inherent to that church. The Presbyterian Church USA still has that because there's still faithful people contending for it, and the Presbyterian Church USA does inherit the true Presbyterian faith. It came over from Scotland. It is it has direct lineage to the Church of Scotland, which converted from Catholicism to Presbyterianism. But these other ones, in separating from the PCUSA, they decided not to involve themselves in the corrective process of the church. And therefore, when something goes awry in, say, the PCA or any of these offshoot churches, ultimately, if it's bad enough, people will just leave. And there's nothing in their founding or there's nothing about these denominations that says they should stay and fight. And I know that not only because I've spoken to many people in these denominations, and basically if you were to go to an OPC pastor or PCA pastor and you said, hey, if this church started to deal with a lot of homosexuality or female pastors started to become a widespread practice within the church, what would you do? Almost invariably, they would say, well, I would just leave. I would just go to another denomination, or maybe a bunch of my buddies would get together and we would start our own. Not only is that the case, just like that's just the attitude across the board, but it's also just in their tradition. Like if you think about it, it would be inconsistent for them to stay and fight because that's not what they did when they were founded. If they had that in their tradition, they would not exist. They would have stayed and fought for the vitality and the strength and the truth of the mainline church. But when they do that, when they leave their church when it goes bad, they're just being consistent with the way that their church was founded. But there are some practical examples I can give you of this happening. Like the most famous example would be J. Gresham Machen when he founded the OPC. J. Gresham Machen was not defrocked for being conservative. He was ousted from the Board of Foreign Missions. He was kicked out because he was misbehaving himself to the media, basically. And in response, he made his own independent board for foreign missions, which was seen as insubordination. And he was asked to disband it, and he said no, which is another act of insubordination. Now, in response to being defrocked, what did J. Gresham Machen do? He just said, well, I don't care what you say, I'm just going to go start the OPC. A more recent example would be what happened in the PCA. I think it was last year or the year before, when the very prominent church, St. Andrew's Chapel, now this is a very famous church. This is the church that was founded by R.C. Sproul. It actually recently joined the PCA. And what happened was, just recently, their pastor, I always forget his name, but he's a very famous, prominent pastor in sort of the Ligonier circles. He was kind of being a jerk, and the PCA, the denomination this church belongs to, looked into the situation, and they found that this guy is unfit to serve as a pastor, and so that's what they found and concluded at their Presbyterian meetings. Now, what did the church, St. Andrew's Chapel, do in response to this ruling? Well, they liked their pastor, so instead of listening to their denomination, they decided that they were just going to vote themselves out of the denomination immediately. Just one Sunday afternoon during a members' meeting, they just voted themselves out of the denomination, and that was that. This is the lapse in observing the authority that is essential to Presbyterianism that I am always talking about. It's like, if you're Presbyterian, that means you respect the authority of the Presbyterian Church. If you don't respect the authority of the church, then you're not Presbyterian. And this does count as an example of a corrective process not actually working in this denomination, because the precedent is the precedent. Like, if a congregation doesn't want to be in this church, they don't have to be. The PCA is going to do nothing about it. It's totally their choice. That's not the case in the PCUSA. Now, there's lots of PCA guys online, or OPC guys, that say they shouldn't have done this. This was terrible. They need to stay and fight for the church. But tell me why what they did was in any way inconsistent with what the PCA originally did. You could say that, well, they didn't leave because of liberalism. We left because of liberalism. They left because they didn't like what the church had to say. And that's the problem. If they really respected Presbyterian, if this was a real Presbyterian church, they would have said, well, the presbytery has authority. We're going to listen to the authority of the presbytery. I think I've explained my reasoning enough. I want to leave you with one more analogy. Now, we have real leather, right? Often coming from cows. Our wallets are made out of it, our belts, our jackets, Bibles, lots of things that we make out of leather. And then there's fake leather, right? And what fake leather does, and especially nowadays does a very tremendous job at it, is it tries to imitate real leather. Some of these fake leathers do a phenomenal job. They feel like real leather. They look like real leather. They sometimes even smell like real leather. They do a lot of the things that actual leather does. But here's the thing. That fake leather will never be real leather. It can't be. It's logically absurd to even suggest that could be the case. Now, real leather can get worn out. It can dry out. It can get sort of holes in it. It can really just start to look rough. It can get so worn out that it might not even look like real leather. It might look less like leather than the fake leather next to it. But that doesn't make it any less leather, and that doesn't make the fake leather any more real than it was before. What's my point with all of this? There is a Presbyterian church. That Presbyterian church in America is the PCUSA. Now, I think part of the problem here is many theologically conservative Christians just don't want to face reality. The Presbyterian church is dealing with some major issues right now. And if we don't just face the facts that the Presbyterian church is not healthy, then we're going to lose Presbyterianism altogether. And so if you are a member of the PCA or the EPC or ECO or OPC, you have two options. Either you can arbitrarily declare the PCUSA dead, which you would have to give a reason for why you think that it really is dead, because there are faithful people contending for the faith within this denomination. Or you can face reality and you can join the true Presbyterian faith and involve yourself in the process of correcting it. Now, I want everyone to have a good rest of their day, a good rest of their week. God bless. Thank you for watching.